Hey there, folks. This is JG. I'm playing Eternal Evolution, and tonight we're going to talk about Rickert, the new assassin that dropped just this week. There's a lot of new content this week, so there's a lot of other things that I want to be able to talk about, but I thought this was probably the highest priority. I know people are asking, should I get Rickert? How does he compare to other champions? And so I want to compare Rickert tonight with Bailey, the other SSS Assassin that folks are salivating over, and talk about the strengths and weaknesses I see of each, where I think they're useful, and whether you should get him. Now, one thing to point out, as I've said before, I am a light spender or free-to-play person, and so I do not have a bunch of copies of Rickert. I do not have him at a high evolution level. I do have one or two of him so far, so he's getting there, but not high enough that I can do a significant playtest. And so really, when new heroes come out, I have to look at them on paper. I have to sort of read through the descriptions and make my own opinion, figure out what I think about them without being able to try them. I do like to look to other content creators that are able to do more of a playtest, but I think it's a good skill to be able to develop, to read these and figure out where they are strong and where they're weak. So I'm going to walk you through my thought process tonight, and we're going to compare these two heroes with each other. Now, before we dive in, I think it's really useful to ask the question, what are we looking for here? What makes a good assassin? If you watched my combat tactics video, I talked about the 4 major combat archetypes you have in this game, which don't necessarily map cleanly onto the character classes. But one of the archetypes is the assassin, and so what makes a good assassin and what sets them apart is that they attack the back row instead of the front row. So these displacement abilities that let them go to the back and start hitting those DPS characters early in battle instead of fighting through the tanks first. That's really what makes an assassin different from your classic DPS. So your energy or hunter style DPS, they stay in the back and they shoot the people in the front. They stay behind the front line. Whereas your assassins jump past the front line and attack the back line. And so that means you need to gear them differently, and you need to look for different skills in them. The biggest difference is that while a DPS character hides behind your tanks to stay safe, the assassin needs to be able to keep itself safe. So your assassins need some survival skills in addition to DPS. So you don't gear them purely for damage, or they die too quickly. The other key thing to remember about assassins is that your goal is to rack up kills. It's not just to put out total damage numbers, but you want to kill someone, because the combat is sort of determined by how quickly that front line crumbles and you start attacking their entire field. If you don't take down someone in the back, then that DPS will continue to do damage to your front row, and your front row will crumble just as quickly as if the assassin hadn't been there. So dealing damage to the back row without killing the back row is rarely very useful to you. So with that in mind, let's dive into these two heroes and see what they have to offer. So I'm going to start with Bailey here. He's been in the game since day one, as far as I know, certainly since the public release. And a lot of people are pretty familiar with him, but let's start by looking at his kit, and then we'll compare where Rickert is different from Bailey. So what we have for the energy skill here is 2 slashes on all enemies in a small area. At your standard sort of max level, that's 218% per slash, so 436% to an area. And I've witnessed this being a pretty large area. He's able to pretty frequently hit the entire field, so 436% times 5, or by like 9 or 10 if you're talking summoners on the field. So he can put out a lot of damage with this one. Additionally, he's got a bunch of passives here. There's a lot to read. We don't have to read all of this exhaustively, because I know a lot of you have seen him before. But basically, he can enter this assassination state where he can't be targeted by skills. He gives that up once he starts attacking. And combine that with some of these other skills, he actually doesn't walk, he only teleports. So he teleports to the person with the lowest HP, starts hitting them, and if they move or if they die, then he has to teleport somewhere else. And this passive says, basically, if there's no one close enough for him to hit, then he enters this unhittable state, and then if you read some of the other skills, he'll teleport again after that. The second one, this explains, he doesn't move. He marks the enemy with the lowest HP. This one's kind of interesting. It doesn't list a duration for mark. The marked enemy will take 8% more damage, and it says later on the mark can be stacked up to 3 times. So you can increase damage by up to 24% on a character if you put this on them enough times. In theory, it takes 31 seconds or so for you to stack all of those, although there are some other things that can reset his skills. I don't believe this has a restriction to Bailey, so in general, this increases everyone's damage against that character. Now, this is one of those places where you want to think about specifically where you're using an assassin, though. This potentially is useful in a boss-type battle, where everyone's hitting the same target, and so you can stack up increased damage on them, and everyone benefits. However, if you're looking at this as an arena skill, even if everyone benefits from the buff, he's probably the only one attacking that character in the back. Everyone else is focused on that front line fight. And so, while it could benefit the whole party, it usually won't. And so this is a place where you want to think about whether this buff sort of pays for itself and the other things that you're giving up by choosing Bailey over another potential hero. This third skill here is just another direct attack. Hits the target, causes 360% attack or up to 420% at max level without commander boosts. And every time he teleports, the cooldown of this is cleared, so he can do this immediately after teleport. So that first hit after a teleport will always be a pretty big one. This is not a bad hit at all. This also notes that when killing an enemy, the damage dealt has a 10% lifesteal. I believe that means only if using the Dig Heart skill, because usually these talent effects are bound to a single skill. That makes it somewhat less useful. I'm not sure how likely it is that that is the killing blow, but it'll happen sometimes. It'll be a little bit of extra survivability, and survivability is good on an assassin. Finally, we have this complicated passive here. So as long as he's attacking the same target, his crit rate and crit damage will grow. That's nice. It's not by enough. The peak here is 15% crit rate after 3 attacks. 3 attacks shouldn't take too long to build up, but 15% crit rate isn't enough for you to just not build crit rate on him. It means you can build a little less crit rate, so you're probably able to do crit damage for your gloves, which potentially increases his total damage output. There's a few other effects. This one really, I think, should be on the track skill, but track refreshes immediately if the target that you've marked dies or anytime he enters assassination state. So essentially, if you've killed someone or they've all run away and he needs to teleport somewhere else, track will reset, so you can always place track. Then there's this low HP effect. When he loses 30% HP, I'm not quite sure how that interacts with healing, but presumably at about the 70% mark, he triggers Hidden, which allows him to flash to the edge of combat. So it says, a safe position on the edge of the battlefield and gains 15% lifesteal for 5 seconds. This seems kind of funky to me, because since he can't walk, flashing to the edge of the battlefield presumably means he's out of the way and not hitting anyone. But then it gives him 15% lifesteal. Well, he can't hit anyone if he's really moved to a safe location. So unless he then is able to trigger maybe his energy skill, this 15% lifesteal I think is pretty likely to be wasted. So this is a place where his kit is not quite ideal. It doesn't synergize super well across all the things that are happening here. The talent effect here, not super impressive. It means that instead of going from 15% down to 0 when switching targets, you go from 15% down to 5%. Not a huge difference. It saves you 1 attack in building it back up. Now, we also want to look at his exclusive here because it has some interesting things that improve his overall power if you're able to boost it up. And of course, for some of these powerful SSS heroes, these are good places to spend your runes in unlocking that exclusive. So the big change here is that 30% HP trigger condition, he gains assassination state. And as this increases, the duration of that is increased. And it says here, this effect continues even after an attack. So this makes him untargetable for a period of time after he's lost HP. That is another really useful survival skill. And the fact that you don't have to cast a skill to do it, it just kicks in when you get to low HP, that's pretty helpful. This is a lot like those tank skills where you get damage immunity the first time you're reduced to 0 HP. One of the things I'm not sure about, what it says on the text of Assassination is you're unable to be targeted by skills. And so there's a couple ways you could interpret that. One could mean no one can hit you, or you could imagine that common attacks can still hit you, not skill attacks, but your basic attacks. And if he's unable to be targeted, what about AoE skills? If you target someone next to him, can he still be caught in the damage? I haven't tested him extensively enough to know the answers to those. I will say, though, damage immunity is an effect they have in the game. If this were just damage immunity, they'd probably say damage immunity. And so I suspect this is a tier lower than damage immunity. It's a good protection ability, but it's not impervious. Now, there's another clause in here that I think needs some careful reading and careful thought, but is potentially useful. When Bailey Hudson inflicts damage to an enemy with lower attack, he inflicts true damage equal to 32% of his attack. And at max level, that goes up to 64% of his attack. In general, true damage sounds great. And especially if you're going to be facing someone that you know has high damage resistance for one reason or another, then true damage is a great way to pierce through all of that and deal some significant damage. Now, one thing you need to ask if you're trying to assess how valuable true damage is just how big does damage reduction get between both defense and the damage reduction capability? Well, in my offensive damage tests that I did and released a little while back about how crit damage works, my analysis, assuming that you're trying to deal 100% of attack on a basic attack, was that in Disa Caves 15, which is where I did those tests, there was a net reduction of 64% by that boss. So that boss was eliminating 64% of Sorietta's base attack in there. And so that's a good baseline to think of for how big damage reduction might get in a boss-like scenario between the combination of defense and damage reduction. And so that means true damage is worth around 3x damage in a typical environment. So overall, if we're looking at 64% of attack, that's worth maybe in the ballpark of 200% attack. And it certainly appears that this happens every time that you inflict damage on someone with lower attack. So your basic attacks, your skills, it's worth an extra 200% hit on each one of those. That is not a bad perk at all. That's going to significantly increase damage. The really important thing to ask is, when will he be attacking someone with lower attack? Now, bosses are one place where this might be valuable. I'm not sure what the base stats on bosses are, although I've noticed a lot of bosses are more tanky than they are high damage. There's lots of bosses where you run out the time on them, whether you're talking Destroyer Quinta or the guild bosses or things like that. There's a lot of them where it's not that hard to just tank them and go to time. So that makes me suspect they might have some lowish base attacks. So against bosses, this potentially really ramps up his damage. Arena, I think, is the one that's worth some thought and analysis. So one of your best case scenarios is going to be Bailey jumping to the back and taking down an Emma or a Luke or a Ravenna, taking out a big damage dealer in the back row before they can get off a lot of attacks. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at the base stats of Bailey versus those heroes, they actually have the exact same stats in a lot of cases. He's got the same stats as Emma, he's got the same stats as Ravenna. So barring any change to those stats from things like your guild bonuses, they start at about the same place. However, you're going to build those characters very differently. So as I've discussed before, assassins need survivability. And so I would in most cases recommend damage reduction boots on your assassins, because that's one of the best ways to decrease their total damage taken with one piece of equipment. However, if you're building Ravenna, Emma, or any other glass cannon back row damage dealer, I would highly recommend attack boots or something similar to that. And so the reality is, when he flashes back there and hits one of these back row damage dealers, there's a good chance that they're built for more attack than he is. You could build him straight attack to try to take advantage of this, but if you do, I think he's going to be ultimately a less effective assassin because he'll die too soon. So while at first glance this might look like an awesome ability, I think it's a little less valuable than it may seem, because I think it's hard to find a situation where he's really maximizing this. Overall, Bailey is a great character, but as we saw here, there's a couple places where the kit isn't quite perfect. And so, moving to Rickert, I think we'll see the same thing. There are some exceptional aspects to it, and there are parts that are not quite what we're looking for. So here we are, Rickert, the new assassin. Let's start with that energy skill again. So, flash behind the enemy, inflicting 4 instances of slash damage. Each slash inflicts 320% of attack, or up to 400% before you're talking commander boosts. So, 4 times 400, this is dealing 1600% attack to a single target. Now, let's compare this to what we had with Bailey. So, Bailey was 218% times 2 in an AoE. And so 436%, which means Bailey's total damage is about worth 1 slash of what Rickert does, but Bailey does it in an AoE. And so, especially if you've got a lot of summons on the field, if he's dealing it times 4, times 5, or higher than that, then Bailey's putting out much more total damage there. However, I think it's worth remembering what is valuable about assassins. The thing we want from an assassin is to rack up kills in the back row. And so I think Rickert maybe takes the cake here, because although he might not put out as much total damage, he's putting out damage in the right places. He gives it to a specific target, and his ability to take down that one target is going to be higher. So when you're looking at that situation where your assassin's going to die before the battle is over, if they can knock down one person, take down 2 people with them, that really turns the tide in your favor. I think I would go for Rickert for the kill when we're talking just energy skills. There's a talent effect here. We'll get to this sword soul effect in just a second, but he absorbs all those on the battlefield. For every 3 absorbed, he does an additional slash. Here's that sword soul skill. It grants 1 sword soul to all allied assassins. I believe this includes himself because he has some text later that indicates that, but I haven't seen that tested. When a hero with a sword soul performs a basic attack, it will attack with them, inflicting 40% of his attack as damage to the enemy. And each hero can have a total of 2 of these. So every time he's able to cast this skill, he adds a sword soul to them. He spends them when he uses his energy skill. And then there's this talent effect here, which any ally with a sword soul, he gains half of their crit rate. So this is fairly reminiscent of Bailey. It's a different mechanic that does sort of the same thing. So whereas Bailey could increase the damage of the rest of the party against a single target, Rickert is granting this sword soul, so whoever any of your other assassins are targeting, they're dealing more damage. So he can passively increase the damage of the rest of the field, which is great. Similarly, while Bailey can build up his crit rate with attacking the same enemy, Rickert can build up his crit rate by buffing other allies. And half the crit rate is an interesting one. This is much more likely than Bailey's skill to be something where you don't really need to build any crit rate on Rickert. If he's stealing 50% from other allies, then you can get a lot out of it. However, the weakness here is this is only granted to allied assassins. I think it's pretty rare that you want to build a party with more than 1 assassin, unless maybe you're talking Twilight Forest and you're trying to get the assassin boost. The assassin jumps to the back row so that you don't have to fight through their front row, but generally you still need a front row. You're going to need a tank, and that tank is going to be protecting someone. And so if you're talking an assassin in the back, a tank in the front, and a glass cannon somewhere else on the field, you've only got 2 slots left. You probably want a healer in there. So there's 1 slot that could maybe be an assassin. So the 2 assassin build is maybe doable, but 3 or more is really rare. And so that sort of diminishes the value of this sword soul skill somewhat, where you're not likely to build a party that takes max advantage of this. Similarly, with a max of 2 stacks and this energy skill, you get an extra slash for every 3 of these absorbed. That is 1 extra hit maybe. That isn't a thing that's going to massively increase his damage here, unless you're building a really funky party for a very specific reason. That said, funky parties for very specific reasons can be really effective. So there may be certain boss battles, or maybe one of those Valentine challenges we had, where if you just went in with a 5 assassin party, he'd have max crit rate. You could just put only crit damage gear on him and just deal some insane party damage. This is sort of like the meta that Daniel unlocked, where throwing a ton of summoners in the same party has a lot of value when you look at Daniel plus the SSS commander that enhances summons. And so those benefits start to stack in interesting ways. So I don't think there's a lot of places today where this is necessarily super relevant, but Rickert may tip the scales here. This is going to be an interesting ability to think about, whether you want to build a team around this specific mechanic. Third skill. This is a lot like Bailey's third skill. It's just a damage dealer. Teleport behind the enemy with the lowest HP, then hit them hard. That said, Bailey's attack was like 200 or 300%. This one, 900%. So again, Rickert is an amazing single target damage dealer. He hits hard. The talent effect here is lovely. Crit damage of this skill increased by 20%. So if you've got him max crit, which you probably want to get him where he's critting most of the time, this is dealing 2000% of attack or something like that. That is a hard hit. That is a very nice skill for dealing out a lot of damage. Like most other assassins, he's got a passive here. So every time Rickert absorbs a sword soul, he's healed by 8% of his max HP. That scales up to higher values at higher levels. And when he receives a fatal injury, he instead becomes immune to all damage, teleports to a random assassin ally, including himself, and absorbs all their sword souls. So that's what makes me think that he can get sword souls himself. And so this is a nice, recover 20% of HP if you're about to die. And this can trigger 2 times per battle. Most other immunity skills only trigger once per battle, so he can really keep kicking for a while if he's putting out enough sword souls that he can heal himself back from this. So this is a pretty interesting one. The other great thing, the talent effect here. When a fatal injury is prevented, the cooldown of Falling Vanguard is refreshed. So that at least means in the couple seconds he has left, even if he doesn't manage to heal back much HP, he's going to get one last really big hit, and that's a pretty lovely effect. Now finally, let's talk about his exclusive. He's got a huge exclusive also. So at the lowest level here, just when you get him to, Mythical 1 where this unlocks, then whenever he uses his energy skill, it refreshes Sword Soul Mantra. But this is pretty interesting. So the energy skill consumes all those sword souls, and remember, with that passive, it means that also heals him quite a bit. But then right after that, the cooldown of creating more sword souls gets refreshed, so you can put them back out there, keep increasing that passive damage, and have them available for further healing if he hits low HP. So that should mean there's pretty much never a situation where there are no sword souls. He should always be able to absorb some for HP. Also, being able to put out a lot of them combined with the energy skill, this is a really nice survival capability. So assassins really benefit from being able to stay alive while they're hacking at those high DPS heroes in the back row. And so having this consistent ability to pull in sword souls, refresh his HP, and stay at high HP is going to keep him back there longer, dealing a lot of damage. At higher levels, the max amount of sword souls that a hero can have is increased, so you can get up to 3 on a hero. Again, if you start thinking about a very assassin-heavy build, then this could be both a lot of healing for him, which you still need to worry about how you keep all those other assassins alive, but on his energy skill, you can start talking 3, 4, 5 extra slashes, and that would be pretty cool. At the level 20 tier, then that fatal injury can be triggered an additional time. So 3 times where he can stop himself from dying. That is unheard of in the game so far. He has the best long-term survival from fatal hits. If you're looking at some of these unique battles, maybe some of the challenge battles or Twilight Forest, where someone just does an insanely large hit, he can resist that 3 times and keep dealing damage. So there's a lot of places where that might be valuable. And then finally, if we're talking those extra slashes from the energy skill, I don't think that's the most powerful mechanic that he has here, but this drops it from 1 extra slash for every 3 to 1 extra slash for every 2. That's going to increase what you can get out of that. So at that point, you're at least pretty reliably gaining 1 extra slash, and if you decide to build a high assassin party, you can get quite a few extra slashes here. So this is a really interesting kit overall. So this is a really interesting kit overall. I think it's got a couple of strengths. So the first thing that I would say is better than Bailey is that he focuses on single target damage and not AoE damage. Obviously, there are going to be some contexts where you want AoE damage, and it does put out more total DPS if you're fighting a lot of enemies. However, I think assassins really shine when they're trying to kill one target. Kill one high-value target before you die, and that will turn the tide in your favor. That's an excellent strategy in Arena, so I think Rickert is excellent in the Arena, and this survivability kit that he has is great for that. Second, he's got an interesting kit here. He potentially unlocks a new meta of these multi-assassin teams that could really shine in certain content. And so I think Rickert, more so than some of the other options, gives you an interesting build that you could try for single target boss battles, where, you know, Bailey's not going to get the multiplier from dealing AoE damage, so Rickert will do more just out of the box. And then if you stack more assassins on top of that, you're potentially getting a lot of damage here. I can look at this for if you're trying to push Terradome levels. This is a way to get a lot of high damage, short range melee attackers all right next to the Terradome boss. And it looks like one of the new bosses that dropped this week has a pretty similar mechanic where you have to be up close. Since a lot of the game's best damage dealers are not up close fighters, Rickert is a way to open the gate to that. The thing that I like a little less about Rickert is his sort of team building dynamic is a little lower than Bailey's. So whereas Bailey can grant this increased damage to everyone else by marking enemies, and after dropping some of those back row heroes, the AoE attacks sort of help in other contexts, Rickert kind of stands alone. If you're not building a full assassin team or a multi-assassin team, his kit gets somewhat weaker. He's still a top-tier single-target damage dealer, but a lot of the rest of his kit, a lot of these sword soul capabilities, become just okay and not really game changers. So I certainly think they're both still useful. I don't know that either one has made the other one obsolete. But honestly, at this point, I would prioritize Rickert over Bailey if you haven't built either one. Unfortunately for me, I'm right in the middle of leveling my Bailey right now. I've got him up to legendary, but not immortal yet. And so that's high enough that I'm going to finish building him before I can focus on anyone else. And unfortunately, since I don't have a glut of SSS heroes, if I've built one assassin, building another assassin is probably not going to be my next priority. So it's going to be a while till I get around to building Rickert. But he looks like a top tier assassin, looks like something very worth obtaining and building over time. So I would recommend looking into it. I think he will serve you well, and certainly what I've heard from guildmates and other playtests that I've seen are that he is putting out a ton of damage for people. Remember, I think the most interesting facet of that is that he puts it out against a single target. That's really where assassins shine, and that's the thing that makes Rickert stand head and shoulders above some of the other options as far as I'm concerned. Hope you enjoyed my analysis. Feel free to subscribe if you want more of this in the future. That's all I've got for tonight. JG out.